Thomas Armstrong is the executive director of the American Institute for Learning and Human Development, and an award-winning author and speaker who has been an educator for over 40 years. Over 1 million copies of his books are in print in English on issues related to learning and human development. He is the author of 16 books and articles, about 300. His books have been translated in over 80 foreign editions into 26 languages. Dr. Armstrong has given over 1,000 keynotes, workshop presentations, and lectures on his continents in 29 countries and 44 states. In the past 30 years, Thomas Armstrong has honored Congress as a special guest. I am inviting Mr. Thomas Armstrong to make his Skype presentation called Neurodiversity.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to speak with you in your wonderful city, Istanbul, which has often been in my dreams and imagination, thinking back to ancient Byzantium and Constantine, and also to Constantinople and the Ottoman Empire. So it's a great thrill for me to be able to address you this morning on the topic of neurodiversity in the classroom. What I would like to ask you to do briefly to begin the presentation is to imagine that you wake up one morning and instead of people, everyone has been transformed into a flower. And some of us are petunias, and some of us are begonias, and some of us are tulips. And I want you to imagine that in that culture of flowers, the roses would be the psychiatrists. And imagine the rose psychiatrist seeing her first patient in the morning, and it happens to be a calla lily. And the rose psychiatrist examines it very carefully and does a final diagnosis saying that this calla lily has petal deficit disorder. Then a sunflower comes in and the psychiatrist diagnoses it with hugism. A bluet comes in and is diagnosed with a growing disability. A cactus comes in and is diagnosed with antisocial disorder. And in each of these cases, these flowers are seen as disordered because they don't measure up to the standard of the rose psychiatrist. Now, this seems very strange, a little bit silly, of course, but the point I want to make is that we value diversity in flowers. The calla lily isn't missing petals, it is what it is. The sunflower is what it is. And we value those unique qualities of each of the flowers. We also value diversity when it comes to animals and animal forms. And we value cultural diversity as well. But when it comes to diversity in brains, we seem to fall back on the rose psychiatrist's Bible, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Now, some people might say, well, we do need some kind of standard for mental health. We need a standard to judge, who is normal and who is abnormal. And I would agree with you that there does need to be a standard. There are standards for certain things. If you go into the basement of the Institute for Weight and Measurements in Paris, you'll find under a couple of bell jars a piece of metal that is the standard kilogram against which all kilograms in the world are measured. People in different countries take their own kilograms to this particular place so that they can calibrate them to this standard. So yes, there are standards and they can be useful. But I want to make a point, and that is there is no normal brain anywhere in the world, in a vat, under a bell jar, or anywhere else, that tells us what is a normal brain. And if there is no standard normal brain, then how can we tell what is abnormal and what is normal? In fact, what we are presented with are a great diversity of brains. And it is from this understanding that I became aware of the concept of neurodiversity. It was actually by first happening upon this website, neurodiversity.com, that I got the great aha experience of saying, yes, this is so true and needs to be developed. And so the idea of neurodiversity, as it was originally developed in the autism community back in the 1990s, has it that neurodiversity is an idea which asserts that atypical or neurodivergent neurological development is a normal human difference that is to be recognized and respected as any other human variation. And so this makes a lot of sense to me. And I spent several years working with this concept, and I've written a couple of books about this topic. And in one of my books, I talk about several principles of neurodiversity. And the first principle is the idea that our image of the brain has been wrong for the past several decades. We've tended to think of the brain as a machine, but in fact, the brain is much more like a rainforest or an ecosystem. If you look at the electrical activity that occurs on the axons of neurons, you'll see something very akin to lightning in the rainforest. If you look at the transmission of neurotransmitters across the synaptic cleft and their reuptake back into the originating neuron, you're seeing something very akin to the ebb and flow of the seed. When we look at the resilience of nature, the capacity of nature to recover from damage, we see something very much precisely the same thing in the human brain. This lady, when she was 11 years old, had her entire right hemisphere taken out because of an epileptic seizure that she was having. And despite having only half of her neocortex, she grew up, she went to college, she graduated, she got a teacher's certificate, and she became a special education teacher because of the resilience of the brain. The idea that the brain is more of an ecosystem or a rainforest is not my idea. It comes from Nobel Prize-winning biologist Gerald Edelman, who says that the brain is in no sense like any kind of instruction machine or a computer. Each individual's brain is more like a unique rainforest teeming with growth, decay, competition, diversity, and selection. The second principle of neurodiversity is the idea that the disorders that we talk about in our culture seem to have a lot to do with the cultural values that we have, that we hold at that time. I'll just give you a couple of illustrations of that. Back in the 1850s in the United States, a New Orleans, Louisiana physician came up with a new disorder that he believed existed called drapetomania. Now, drapeto means to flee, and mania means an obsession. So he believed that drapetomania afflicted large numbers of runaway slaves. We had slavery in this country at that time until the Civil War, and the Civil War in the 1860s. And so here he was saying, these people have a disorder because they want to leave the plantation and seek freedom. So we see in this racism clearly a cultural value of that time in the Deep South in America. But for them, it was science. Similarly, in the 20th century, psychiatrists used terms like feeble-mindedness, moron, imbecile, and idiot to describe individuals who scored poorly on IQ tests. And these are words that we now use as insults. So we have to really keep in mind how the disorders that we have in our time reflect the issues of the time. I've been writing recently on the topic of attention deficit disorder, and it seems to me no accident that we come up with a disorder like that just at a time when we are living in a short attention span culture due to mass media. The third principle of neurodiversity has to do with success. And that idea of helping our children, helping our adults and children with special needs achieve success, part of that success means helping them adapt to the environment around them. We see this in the natural world, where the penguin has had to adapt to the cold climate it lives in by, through natural selection, developing the fur and other means of anatomically coping with the cold weather. In the same way, as educators, we need to help children adapt to the classroom, adapt to reading, to writing, to mathematics, and other topics. So that is an important part of what we do as educators, is to help kids adapt to the environment. And we do a good job of that. But that's only half of what it means, in my estimation, to be successful or to help children be successful. The second type of success, I believe, is the flip side of the adaptation success. I would call this actualization success, where we change the environment around the child to meet who that child really is. There's a name for this in developmental biology. It's niche construction. Niche construction is a species' ability to change its environment to maximize its chances for survival. And we see lots of examples of that in nature. When a beaver builds a dam, he is changing the environment to maximize his own gifts, his own strengths. Same thing with the spider spinning a web, or a bird building a nest, or a group of ants building an anthill, or bees creating a hive. In each of these cases, they're not waiting around for natural selection to change characteristics that will match those of the environment they happen to be in. Rather, they take the bull by the horns and they go ahead and change the environment to meet who they already are. And that's what I suggest we need to do much more of in the field of education. And I've used a term I call positive niche construction, which means helping to ensure the thriving of a child or a student, this could be an adult student, by directly modifying the environment in such a way that it enhances that person's chances for success. The fifth principle of neurodiversity is that when we do this, when we build niches, when we build positive niches for our students, this has a direct impact on the structures and functions of their brain. We know this because of experiments that go back to the 1960s that were initially done at the University of California in Berkeley, where they put rats in different environments. Some rats, as you see here, were in an enriched environment with several rats and various things to do in the cage. And then there was an environment that was considered an isolated cage, where one rat was all by himself with nothing to do, and the other cage was the standard laboratory cage. Well, at the end of several months, they dissected the brains of these rats. And this is a neuron, and the dendrites, or branches that make connections with other neurons, this is the neuron of a rat from an enriched environment. And this is a neuron over here of a rat from an isolated environment. And you see that there are less dendrites. There are fewer dendrites, there's less branching. So essentially, the environment had a big impact on growing connections between brain cells. So we actually create an enriching neurological environment for the student when we modify the environment, when we create a positive niche for each student. Now, I've got 7 practical components of positive niche construction that I'd like to spend the rest of this presentation going through. Each of these components provides something new, something special to create the affirmativeness of the environment in which the child lives. And the first and most important of those components is strength awareness. Because if we don't see what the gifts, talents, and abilities of our students with special needs are, first of all, we're going to be carrying a negative image around with us about them, which will hamper our ability to come up with solutions to help them. They will be hearing us carrying that negative climate of expectation around, and that's going to impact how they behave. There's research supporting the idea of the Pygmalion effect, that the expectations that teachers have for students actually impacts their achievement in the classroom and their IQ scores. And so really what I'd like to do now is go through some of the strengths that recent research has identified in association with certain specific diversities, including autism spectrum disorder, dyslexia, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, intellectual disabilities, and emotional and behavioral disorders. So let me talk about autism spectrum disorder strengths. One of the strengths that's been identified is people diagnosed with ASD are very good with small details. They're good at locating small details. This is a puzzle from, maybe you have this book in Turkey, Where's Waldo? And you have all these people and you have to find Waldo in all of this. And I'll just help you out here. This is Waldo right here. And a person diagnosed with ASD probably can do this more quickly than a typically developing person. They also do better than typically developing people on what is called the embedded figures task, where a shape like this triangle has to be found in this more complex drawing, or where this has to be found in this drawing. People who are diagnosed with ASD are able to do this more quickly and efficiently than typically developing people. They also do very well if an IQ test called the Raven's Progressive Matrices is used instead of the standard IQ test, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. If you give them this IQ test instead of the other, their scores go up 30 to 70%. That's very significant. And this may have to do, let me just skip over this one for a moment, to do with the idea that people diagnosed with ASD tend to be systemizers rather than empathizers. This is a distinction made by Simon Baron-Cohen, a research scientist at Cambridge University. When he talks about systems, he's talking about everything from machines to mathematical systems to football games. And it seems that people with the diagnosis of ASD are really fascinated with machines. At a very low functioning level, it might be a child fascinated with the workings of a fan. At a very high level, it might be an autistic savant who has the ability to calculate large numbers rapidly in their mind. Speaking of savants, that's another indication of the talents and gifts related to autism. This is a book that was written about a girl who had ASD diagnosis, and we look at it and we say, well, that's a pretty good drawing, but we have to understand that this was done by a 5-year-old child. This man, Daniel Tammet, also has a diagnosis of autism. He has gifts for both linguistic and logical mathematical domains. You see him here. He was able to work out the value of pi, pi, to, I think, the 10,000 decimals. And he did it in front of an audience. So he also has a gift for language. He was able to master Icelandic in 1 week and go on Icelandic television and carry on a half-hour conversation with the commentator. Finally, people with an autism diagnosis have a lot of special interests. Each one very sometimes unusual. It may be World War II propeller planes. It might be waste paper baskets. It might be the list of the people who are on the Titanic. But they have strong interests in this area, and many times these are seen in a negative way as obsessions. But more recently, we've begun to appreciate the fact that these interests may, in fact, help to fan the flames of a future profession for them. Next, let me talk about the strengths and gifts related to dyslexia. It seems that many people with dyslexia have acute three-dimensional perceptual abilities. There's a test called the impossible figures task, where people are shown pictures of structures, and then they're asked to decide if that structure could be built in real life or not. And people with dyslexia were able to more quickly and efficiently give the correct answer. This, of course, being an example of something that could not be built. This reminds us of the work of Escher, the artist Escher. Now, this particular gift of 3 dimensions also came up in my doctoral dissertation, which I did in the 1980s. I focused on the strengths of children who'd been labeled learning disabled. And this particular child did this drawing of a bird's eye view of a car, as if he was looking down from a helicopter or a plane. This 3-dimensional thinking ability has many practical applications in the real world. For example, animators, or architects, or geneticists, or surgeons. They all need to have 3-dimensional abilities. And so dyslexia may, in some ways, be associated with and favor some of those occupations. I'll talk about occupations more in depth a little bit later. But again, I want to point out something else about dyslexia. It's the capability of dyslexics to look at fuzzy images and see form inside the fuzziness. In one test, they are asked to look for this particular feature within this blurred image. And people with dyslexia are able to learn this more quickly than even typically developing Harvard University students. And this particular mode of sort of wide fuzzy perception has applications in the worlds of radiology, in looking at x-rays, in microbiology, in cosmology, among many other cutting-edge professions. People with dyslexia also have gifts and abilities in entrepreneurship. One study that was done at the Cass Business School in London found that 33% of self-employed individuals who had their own businesses identified as having dyslexia, compared to only 2% of middle managers in large corporations. So there's something about that ability of dyslexics to see the wide picture, to see something that other people don't see. We notice that there are several billionaires out there who have either dyslexia or ADHD or a combination of that, of the two. You've got Ted Turner of Turner Broadcasting, Richard Branson, Charles Schwab, who has a brokerage industry, Paul Orfila, who developed Kinko's copier centers, all have either a diagnosis of dyslexia or ADHD. Now let's talk about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and the gifts and strengths associated with it. Now, some individuals have proposed that individuals with ADHD, in fact, had evolutionary advantages in hunting and gathering societies. And that may help explain why those genes are still in the gene pool. If you look at it in terms of the hunter, a hunter has to be constantly on the move to, find their game. Well, that's hyperactivity, right? The hunter has to pay attention to many things, is constantly looking around. Is there an animal here? They also, not just the animals they're searching for, but they also have to be aware of the animals that are searching for them that want to make lunch out of them. So attention is diffused, and we call this in the ADHD child distractibility. The hunter has to respond quickly to the snap of a branch or the sound of an animal, and we call this impulsivity. So these three, the major traits associated with ADHD are in fact evolutionary advantages in some cultures, including hunting and gathering cultures. They seem also to be strongly associated with creativity. If we look at the creative person, we see that they seem to manifest the same three basic symptoms. In fact, let's look at the list here. If we look at hyperactivity, in the creative person, we call that vitality. For ADHD, we talk about distractibility, but that's the divergent mind of the creative person. It's always looking and making connections and making unusual connections. The impulsivity of the ADHD child is the spontaneity of the artist. The hyperfocus of ADHD is the passion and the flow experience of the creative person. And finally, the so-called poor executive function of ADHD, we can link to the creative imagination. This is also linked to another aspect of creativity, which is novelty seeking. People with ADHD diagnoses love novelty. They hate boredom. They get really sick with boredom and always need to be trying new things. Well, that's the essence of creative behavior. One more thing that I think is very interesting is that we've discovered recently that brain growth is delayed in many children with the diagnosis of ADHD. And this has been seen as another proof that ADHD is a medical disorder. But another interpretation of this is simply that there's delayed brain growth, that these are kids whose brains are developing normally, but just 2 or 3 years later than typically developing kids. We can call that delayed brain growth, we can call it immaturity, or we can call it neoteny, which is a term from evolutionary biology. Neoteny is a Latin word meaning holding youth, and it means holding on to youthful traits into adulthood. We look, for example, at this chimpanzee in childhood. It has very human-like features, but when that child grows up, those features are lost. So there is no neoteny with respect to those features. Whereas when we look at a human being, we see the child features are pretty much retained. Now, the small details like glasses and gray hair and such, certainly that changes. But the basic shape of the chin and the forehead and so on remain the same. Those traits are held into adulthood. So there is neoteny. And many people, including Harvard University's Stephen Jay Gould, believe that neoteny is one of the key factors in evolution and one of the key traits that make human beings evolutionarily more advanced than chimpanzees, for example. Now, we call this immaturity, why don't you grow up, we say. But we've got to remember that many of our creative individuals who have contributed amazing things to our culture have held on to their youthful traits as well. Not just the outward traits, but they've held on to their imagination, the imagination of the child, the playfulness of the child, the curiosity of the child. And these are traits that kids labeled with ADHD have often to a high degree, more than typically developing kids. Let's go on to intellectual disabilities. These are often defined in terms of IQ score. And individuals who score usually, somewhere in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and so forth. And so people with Down syndrome represent one dimension of intellectual disabilities. Dr. Downs, who gave us the syndrome, the name of the syndrome in the 1940s, said that, perhaps it was earlier, I don't have my dates correct, but Downs said that kids with Down syndrome have a real ability to mimic others, that they have a sense of drama, of dramatic improvisation, so to speak. And this is just an example of a person with Down syndrome named Pablo Pineda, who is a famous actor in Spain, who's won many awards. So we see gifts and talents in Down syndrome. Another positive dimension of Down syndrome is the personal charm, the friendliness, the warm-heartedness that we see in so many individuals with Down syndrome. And this shouldn't be minimized, Part of the problem is that we give too much credence to IQ scores and not enough credence to the value of simply being a good human being. When we get to other intellectual...
excuse me, Mr. Armstrong?
Yes. Yes.
The time is over now. The time is finished.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Can you say a few more sentences to finish your presentation?
Sure.
Okay,
sure.
please.
I promised you that I would finish with Leonardo da Vinci's IEP meeting. So let me finish with that, okay?
Okay.
I didn't realize. I thought we were going to go ahead and have a whole hour of. Here, I'll go to the end, and I want to take us through a special education meeting of Leonardo da Vinci.
Okay.
Now imagine that Leonardo da Vinci's principal and teachers are there, and the principal says, okay, let's start to talk about Leonardo's problems. So the school psychologist says he has a bad attention, he keeps looking at parts of the wall where the plaster had fallen off, and he sees a battleship fighting a dragon, and they wonder whether he has psychotic features. The learning disability specialist says, well, he writes backwards. That could be a soft sign of neurological dysfunction. The classroom teacher sees him reversing numbers and letters in the classroom and daydreaming and doodling. The learning disability specialist says he seems to be a good candidate for psychostimulant like Ritalin. The classroom teacher thinks that would help them a lot, and says that, all he seems to want to do is fix things and look at machines and stuff. And the learning disability specialist says we should take him out of his art class because that's not very important, and we should focus on his handwriting and his spelling. And the principal says that sounds like a good idea because he says he can't exactly make a living by doodling, can he? And of course, he did make a living by doodling and drawing and creating some of the greatest art we've ever seen. So the point I want to make is don't let this happen to the little Leonardos in our classrooms, to the children who think differently, who behave differently, who attend differently. Let's value the diversity of ways in which they can contribute to our world. And if we do this, our world is going to be much stronger, much more resilient, and much more wonderful. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Armstrong. See you later. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you so much.